Tonight, we drift through sea mist and cannon smoke, sailing quietly into the ghostly chill of the Tsushima Strait. The waves slap softly against steel hulls as massive ships caked with salt and soot roll forward into the dark like sleepwalkers in armor. It's May 27th, 1905. The hour is early, the wind light, and the sea deceptively peaceful. Beneath the stillness, thousands of men aboard the Russian Baltic fleet squint into the fog, unaware that within the hour their world will collapse. Somewhere out there, crouched low on the water like silent panthers, the Imperial Japanese Navy waits with barrels raised and powder dry. You're on a Russian deck now, tired, unshaven boots, sticky with oil ears, ringing faintly from the constant churning of steam. You lean over the rail and see nothing but sea and stars. You might even feel safe. But you shouldn't, because tonight you're about to witness one of the fastest, most humiliating naval defeats in history, and if we're honest, you probably wouldn't survive it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere across the seas, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where history is being heard. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air smells of coal smoke, sour wool and salt. Every creak of the hull echoes through the bones of the Russian fleet. They've been at sea for over 7 months, crossing from the chilly grey of the Baltic Sea to the sticky warmth of the South China Sea, and now into this ominous bottleneck between Japan and Korea. These ships, more than 30 in total, are the last hope of a crumbling empire trying desperately to win a war it has already mostly lost. They were supposed to reinforce Russia's position in Manchuria to break the Japanese blockade at Port Arthur, but Port Arthur fell months ago. Nobody told the fleet. You feel the tension in the officers' voices, brittle and hollow like porcelain. The crew is bone-tired, riddled with disease, and deeply confused about where the enemy might be. You walk past stacks of coal-smeared gun barrels and sailors sleeping with boots on and buttons undone. The ship's radio crackles with updates, but the Russian wireless system is half-blind and barely secure. Japan, by contrast, has turned the telegraph into an art form. Along its coastlines, it has laid out a web of wireless stations feeding Admiral Togo Heihachiro live updates about your every movement. Historians still argue whether the Russian Admiral Rozhestvensky even believed he'd win this battle, or whether he simply hoped to survive it with enough ships intact to make a deal. Either way, he didn't know he was heading straight into the worst possible place, the Tsushima Strait. It's a narrow stretch of water between Korea and Japan's Kyushu Island, and it offers little maneuvering room for large fleets. Worse, it was exactly where Togo had expected the Russians to sail. Some suggest that had Rozhestvensky veered east or west, things might have ended differently. But that night he sailed straight into the jaws. You glance out to sea, still blanketed in low fog. Japan's fleet lies invisible beyond the haze, having spent days anchored and waiting. Togo's ships are cleaner, faster, better trained. And most importantly, they know you're coming. There's something unnerving about the silence. No signal flares, no warning shots. Just stillness like the pause in a thunderstorm before the lightning cracks. Aboard your ship, the crew fumbles through last-minute drills. Some men peel potatoes. Others stare into the waves, muttering prayers in Russian Orthodox crosses, hanging around their necks like tiny anchors. One sailor jokes too loudly that if Japan doesn't kill them, the canned meat will. Someone laughs, then someone shushes him. The mood swings from nervous banter to sickly quiet. Suddenly, through the mist, you spot the flicker of light, then several. It's not the moon, it's the Japanese signal lanterns. Within moments, the fog glows red and orange as gunfire erupts from the horizon. You hear the whine of shells, then the concussive slam of impact. Metal screams as it tears. A Russian battleship to your left bursts into flames. Men dive into the sea. Someone shouts orders, but they vanish into the thunder of cannon fire. Togo has begun the maneuver that will go down in history, crossing the T. By sailing perpendicular to the Russian line of ships, he's positioned his fleet to fire, broadside, every gun blazing, while the Russians can only respond with the few cannons mounted on their bows. It's a massacre in the making, and it hasn't even lasted 10 minutes yet. One lesser-known detail: as the battle starts, several Russian officers are reportedly so stunned that they freeze up entirely, forgetting to issue commands. Some even misfire or aim too low, shells splashing harmlessly into the sea. Historians still debate whether this was due to panic, poor training, or just sheer exhaustion from months aboard. Probably all three. You crouch now as the deck shakes under your boots. Splinters fly. The air fills with smoke and screams. Somewhere nearby, a medic drags a man whose arm is hanging by a thread. And yet, through all this, some sailors still try to reload. The guns still cling to their stations with the dogged hope that maybe somehow they'll make it to Vladivostok. You won't. Not tonight. Not through this strait. You stand now at the beginning of an absurd, almost comical prologue to the horror you've just witnessed, a journey so wildly improbable that by the time the Russian fleet reached Tsushima, it was already beaten in spirit, if not yet in steel. 7 months earlier, in October 1904, the Russian Baltic fleet sailed out from Kronstadt near St. Petersburg with over 40 vessels in tow, ranging from formidable battleships to creaky repair ships and hospital vessels that probably should have stayed docked. Their mission: to sail 18,000 miles, yes, miles, all the way to East Asia to rescue the failing Russian campaign against Japan. It was in every possible sense a logistical nightmare dressed up in brass buttons. The fleet's route was sheer lunacy. Too nervous to pass through the Suez Canal, what if the British interfered? They chose to go the long way around Africa, dodging coasts they barely understood, in waters full of sickness and storm. You trudge below deck now, where coal dust chokes your throat and rats scurry under hammocks. The air is thick with sweat, brine, and hopelessness. Somewhere in the corner, a samovar whistles feebly. You sip tea and try not to think about the time you accidentally fired upon a British fishing boat in the North Sea, thinking it was a Japanese torpedo vessel. Yes, that really happened. The Russians, in their paranoid haze, opened fire on innocent trawlers. The result: international outrage and near war with Britain before the fleet had even left Europe. Historians still argue whether this incident showed true panic or just profound incompetence. The fleet carried with it an astounding volume of random cargo barrels of sauerkraut vodka in quantities not meant for war, and even live animals, cows, chickens, pigs, all intended to supplement the shipboard diet. The cows were reportedly paraded around the decks daily for exercise. Sailors joked darkly about who'd end up in the stew pot next. And yet it wasn't all grim. On Sundays, the ships held religious services with priests blessing the crew as incense drifted over rusting deck rails. One officer kept a pet monkey named Vasya, who supposedly mimicked salutes and relieved tension during rough days. That's not battlefield rumor, that's just the kind of weird morale boost they needed after the 50th day at sea. Every stopover was a diplomatic headache. In Madagascar, the fleet waited weeks for supplies. In French ports, they encountered delays, raised eyebrows, and more than a few bored colonial officials wondering what on earth this rust-bucket armada was doing so far from home. Fueling the ships was a Herculean task. Coal had to be loaded by hand, often by underpaid local laborers or the sailors themselves. Black dust covered everything: uniforms, bedsheets, dinner plates. After a while you gave up washing. Even the officers looked like chimney sweeps. Disease swept through the fleet. Dysentery and typhoid claimed the weakest, while the heat warped ammunition casings and made engine rooms unbearable. You try sleeping in a hammock, but the smell of grease and old socks is overwhelming. The fans rattle. The engines thump like a mechanical heartbeat. Someone coughs blood a few bunks over, but no one says anything. Everyone just hopes the ship stays afloat another day. By the time the fleet reached the Indian Ocean, morale was practically non-existent. Letters from home when they arrived were weeks old and often filled with grim news. Port Arthur was under siege. Japanese forces were advancing, and no one back in Russia seemed sure what the plan was anymore. You begin to wonder if this is all just a very expensive way to disappear. Some of the fleet's worst problems came not from the enemy, but from within. Officers disagreed constantly. Chain of command wobbled. Rozhestvensky, the fleet's commander, was a man of volcanic temper and brilliance in equal measure, but he grew increasingly isolated. He rarely confided in subordinates. One story goes that during a particularly tense meeting, he barked at a junior officer to swim home if he didn't like the orders. Historians debate whether Rozhestvensky was breaking under pressure or simply always this unstable. Then came the tropical storms. In the South China Sea, the fleet was battered by typhoons that tossed their top-heavy ships like corks. Masts snapped, lifeboats vanished, and men were lashed to the rails to avoid being swept overboard. You grip the handrails and stare at the wall of black water rising ahead. Lightning dances across the sky, silhouetting the broken line of ships desperately trying to stay together. You think, not for the first time, that this whole thing feels cursed. By the time you limp toward the coast of Vietnam, where the final rendezvous is planned, the fleet has been thinned out by illness, mechanical failures, and poor coordination. One cruiser accidentally collides with another. Two ships nearly run aground. Everyone is jumpy, hungry, and absolutely sick of the phrase maintain formation. You don't even care about the war anymore. You just want to see land or a letter or something that smells less like mildew. And then finally the message arrives: head north toward Korea, toward the Tsushima Strait. No one says it, but everyone knows this is it. The last gamble of the voyage. You squint at the horizon and wonder if the Japanese are really out there. Maybe they've moved, maybe they've missed you, maybe you'll slip through the strait unnoticed, but deep down you feel it in your bones. You've come too far, too slow, and too loud. And Togo is waiting. You stand now on the deck of a ship that doesn't belong to Russia. It's cleaner, quieter, the brass is polished, the gunners look focused, and no one is parading cows across the planks. This is the Mikasa Admiral Togo Heihachiro's flagship, and it smells less like coal smoke and more like quiet confidence. Here, strategy is not shouted, but measured like tea poured just to the rim. Togo doesn't pace or bellow. He listens, observes, then he gives orders that rarely need repeating. He's the kind of man who seems slow until he strikes. You watch him for a moment. He stands on the bridge, hands calmly behind his back, watching the horizon. He's in his late 50s, but you'd guess younger. His uniform is crisp, his gaze is heavy. He's short by Western standards, but something about his posture makes him taller. He was born into a samurai family from Satsuma, one of the domains that had rebelled against the Tokugawa shogunate. And now he commands a modern navy against a European empire. The irony probably isn't lost on him. Years earlier, he studied in England, learned naval science, and quietly absorbed the writings of Alfred Thayer Mahan, the American strategist, who believed sea power defined world power. Togo didn't just read Mahan, he tested Mahan's ideas like a blacksmith tests a blade, and at Tsushima he would wield them. Historians still argue whether Togo was a tactical genius or just extraordinarily well prepared. But one thing's clear, he didn't leave anything to chance. In the months leading to the battle, he rehearsed maneuvers, refined communication signals, and maintained fleet discipline like a concert conductor. He even took time to memorize the likely paths the Russian fleet would follow, guessing with eerie precision that they would come through the Tsushima Strait instead of taking the longer eastern route around Japan. You move across the deck of the Mikasa now, stepping between rows of neatly arranged signal flags and binocular stations. You see sailors sitting cross-legged near their gunnery positions, eating rice and pickled vegetables, chatting in hushed tones. They know what's coming, they've trained for it. Most of them have been in combat already against Russia's Pacific Squadron against land targets in Manchuria. This is not their first firestorm. One sailor sharpens a bayonet not because he thinks he'll need it, but because it calms the nerves. Another folds a good luck charm into the cuff of his sleeve. Superstition is quiet, practical. There are letters tucked into boots coins tied with string, and famously many crews had painted dragons or lucky kanji on the barrels of their cannons. Whether it worked, no one could say, but it didn't hurt. Togo meets briefly with his officers. There's no grand speech, no florid rhetoric, just calm reminders, logistical updates, and that one crucial phrase he utters before battle. The fate of the empire depends on the outcome of this battle. Let every man do his utmost. It's a statement heavy with consequence, but not panic. It's not shouted. It doesn't need to be. You can hear the Morse tapping now, click, 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 from the coastal stations. Japanese scouts have sighted the Russian fleet. Wireless messages pass through an invisible web of signals running up and down Japan's coast, from Nagasaki to Sasebo, from Shimane to the war rooms in Tokyo. This was one of the first wars to use radio communication in a coordinated naval setting. The Japanese had developed their wireless skills early, working with Marconi's system, and now at Tsushima, they would use it to orchestrate a ballet of steel. Meanwhile, back in the Russian fleet, Rozhestvensky, whatever his skills as a commander, couldn't compete in this new dimension. His radio system was spotty, his signals were often confused, and many of his officers still relied on flags and shouted orders over the wind. One tragic misfire during a training drill weeks earlier had even resulted in one Russian ship shelling another by mistake. On Togo's side, the chain of command held. The wireless buzzed, the fleet moved in fluid arcs. And then the waiting. You feel it settle on the Mikasa like a morning mist. No one says it, but everyone feels it. The Russians are coming. Every sailor on board double-checks ammunition. Gunners adjust their elevation dials with care, whispering to themselves. The Mikasa's engines hum. There's a stillness not unlike the eerie calm before a summer storm. You can practically taste the gunpowder already, even though none has been fired. Togo orders the fleet to ready for battle. They will allow the Russian fleet to enter the strait. Then, at just the right angle, they will curve across the Russian line like the blade of a scythe. It's a maneuver called crossing the T. Picture the Russian line sailing straight like the vertical stroke of a capital T. Now picture the Japanese fleet sailing perpendicular across their bow, forming the horizontal bar. That's the move. It puts the Russians in a bottleneck, able to fire only a few guns forward while the Japanese unload their full broadsides. But it's more than geometry. It's timing, it's discipline, it's nerves. It's Togo's complete confidence that his ships will hold formation even under fire. You climb to the signal tower now, flags ripple in the wind, telescopes are trained on the horizon. One officer murmurs a prayer, then quietly adjusts the position of his cap. The radio clicks again. Contact confirmed. The Russian fleet is just miles away. Togo doesn't flinch. He doesn't shout. He lifts his arms, slow, deliberate, and gives the signal to begin. The fleet begins to move in silence. The Mikasa leads the line with destroyers and cruisers, following behind like sharks tracking a drifting whale. Somewhere in the mess hall, a kettle still whistles. A cook removes it carefully, as if not to disturb the choreography. You grip the rail. The sea is too calm, the stakes are too high, and Togo, as always, simply watches. You're now hovering just slightly above the waves, watching two empires drift toward one another like clockwork animals wound up on opposite sides of a sea. Each one armed to the teeth, each one carrying centuries of ambition, anxiety, and deep cultural wounds. It's not just ships and shells moving through the Tsushima Strait, it's history, imperial history, national identity, and a very fragile balance of global power teetering toward an Asian future that most of Europe frankly still doesn't believe possible. You zoom out now, lifting above the water. To your left, Japan, a nation that had gone from rice-farming samurai to steam-powered sovereignty in less than 4 decades. Just 40 years ago, Togo's country was still under the Tokugawa shogunate, closed off from the world, wary of Western influence, proud and inward-looking. Then came Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853, and everything changed. Japan's leaders, especially the reformers of the Meiji Restoration, knew the game had changed. Industrialization, centralization, modern military, modern navy. That's what survival would take, and somehow, miraculously, Japan pulled it off. By 1905, Japan wasn't just modern, it was motivated. It had beaten China a decade earlier in the First Sino-Japanese War. It had built a fleet that could rival older European navies. It had watched with hawk-like attention how colonial powers carved up the globe, and it knew that if it wanted a seat at the imperial table, it would have to fight for it. Now pan right, toward Russia. An empire larger than any other on Earth, but increasingly brittle. It had autocrats, aristocrats, and a lot of anxiety. Its population was poor, rural, and angry. Its economy lagged behind Western Europe, and its military, though vast in numbers, was riddled with inefficiencies, outdated command structures, and more than a few internal rivalries. Still, the Tsar wanted a warm water port. He wanted Manchuria. He wanted influence in Korea. And he didn't think Japan would pose much of a problem. Historians still argue whether Russia truly underestimated Japan or if it simply overestimated its own strength. The Tsar's advisors were split. Some warned that Japan's navy was fast, modern, and dangerous. Others scoffed, calling Japan an oriental curiosity, or worse. You hear that term whispered now in the halls of the Winter Palace, a palace whose ceilings are gilded while its gutters freeze. The same palace that within a decade will echo with gunfire and revolution. But we're not there yet. We're here in the spring of 1905, staring down the corridor of Tsushima. You drop back into the Russian fleet where you find Rozhestvensky pacing his deck with clenched fists. He knows the stakes. He knows the voyage has weakened his men. He knows Japan has the home advantage. But he believes that if he can reach Vladivostok just a few hundred miles away, he can reinforce the Russian presence in the Far East and salvage national pride. It's a desperate hope, but it's all he has left. Somewhere in St. Petersburg, the newspapers print optimistic headlines. Somewhere in Tokyo, the emperor waits in silence, confident but reserved. There are no cheering parades, no victory banners, only quiet, focused anticipation. That's the Japanese style, at least for now. Back on the Japanese side, you stroll through naval headquarters in Tokyo. The walls are lined with maps, reports, intercepted messages. The mood is calm but charged. Japan's foreign minister, Komura Jutaro, keeps a careful eye on Western diplomats. They're watching. They're skeptical. If Japan wins decisively, the world will have to accept it as a peer. If it loses, it confirms every sneer about Eastern inferiority. That's what makes this battle more than just a military confrontation. It's a cultural inflection point. Japan is fighting for international recognition. Russia is fighting to retain its crumbling sense of superiority. You walk now through the Japanese command tent near the coast of Kyushu. A young officer is decoding messages. Another is sketching the latest positions of the Russian fleet on a chalkboard. There's no music, no laughter, just the sound of brushes, ink, and quiet calculation. Odd detail. One Japanese staff officer is said to have brought along a full tea set and served censure throughout the wait. Not out of ceremony, but because it steadied the nerves. In a war where seconds matter, a calm mind is more useful than a loud one. Meanwhile, inside Russian bunk rooms, a group of sailors play cards by lantern light. One of them cheats openly. No one cares. Another reads aloud from a battered copy of Pushkin, while others carve their names into the wood. They've been drifting toward this battle for so long that many now treat it like a foregone conclusion. Whether that's fatalism or fatigue is hard to say. You peek into the engine rooms. Russian stokers shovel coal into red-mouthed furnaces, their skin stained grey from soot. Some of the older ships leak around the seams. Others groan every time they change course. You begin to understand how little chance they really have. The Japanese fleet isn't just newer, it's cleaner, faster, tighter. And then there's the discipline gap. Aboard Japanese vessels, officers drill their men daily, even during calm seas. Signals are practiced, formations rehearsed. The gunnery teams know their targets down to the yard. In contrast, the Russian fleet is a mixed bag. Some officers are competent, others dangerously out of touch. Some sailors are veterans, others were conscripted from farming villages and had never seen the ocean before this year. Still, there's bravery aboard these ships. Raw, imperfect, weary bravery. They know the odds, but they also know that even in a broken empire, duty still echoes loud enough to silence fear, at least for a while. You return now to the water's surface. The distance between the fleets narrows. You can almost feel the tension ripple through the air, like heat on pavement. Togo is on the move. Rojestvensky is locked into his course. The ocean feels like it's holding its breath. Everything that led here, centuries of isolation, decades of ambition, months of sailing, now condenses into a narrow line of sea between two nations. The day is about to begin, and it will not end the way Russia hopes. You're floating now above a ship that doesn't quite know whether it's a war machine or a floating barn. The Russian fleet, though grand in scale, is a strange zoo of vessels, some modern, others laughably outdated, patched together in desperation, and crewed by a blend of reluctant recruits, exhausted veterans and conscripts who barely know how to swim, let alone fire a naval gun. The battleships stand proud, bristling with big caliber cannons, but then next to them there are transport ships, overloaded with crates, livestock and even furniture. One officer brought his piano, another brought a sofa from his estate in Odessa. You walk across the deck and nearly trip over a crate of onions. It's not just the decor that's strange, it's the diet, the discipline and the hygiene. The fleet has been at sea for over 200 days. The sailors are gaunt, sunburnt, their uniforms stiff with dried salt. The laundry situation is so bad that many men rotate the same few shirts stiff as canvas. You descend into one of the lower decks and immediately gag. The smell of old boots, canned beef sweat and engine grease is overwhelming. No one mentions it anymore, you just live with it. You try not to breathe too deeply. Then there are the cows. Yes, cows. A handful of Russian ships carry live cattle on board, not as mascots but as mobile meat. They move from pens lashed to the upper decks, munching hay and staring blankly at the horizon. When rations run low or spoil, a cow gets marched to the galley. It's a grim parade, yet somehow these awkward, lumbering animals have become part of the ship's rhythm. Sailors give them nicknames, a few even pet them between shifts, muttering about home. It's easy to forget that this is supposed to be a fighting force, yet discipline is breaking down. Arguments flare. A midshipman gets caught stealing from the officer's pantry. Two sailors nearly come to blows over a torn hammock. Rojestvensky has tried to keep order, but his temper is legendary. He lashes out in meetings, curses under his breath, and rarely consults his captains. One story claims he stopped speaking entirely for days, communicating by note or glare. Historians still debate whether his isolation was tactical detachment or a slow spiral into exhaustion and despair. But even at its worst, the fleet clings to routine. There are still inspections, still drills, still a vague hope that if they just push forward a little more, they might reach Vladivostok and regroup. Some officers try to raise spirits with poetry readings or hymns. Others allow chess games or small gambling dens to distract the crew. One quirky tale that survives is of a ship's doctor who organized a lecture series on tropical medicine delivered in French, which half the sailors didn't understand, but they came anyway just to sit in chairs and pretend life made sense. You're in the engine room now. The Russian ships are coal-powered beasts, and the coal stokers are some of the hardest working, most miserable people on board. Shirtless, caked in soot, they shovel endlessly into roaring furnaces that make the air feel like you're breathing through a wet towel. Some collapse from heat stroke. Others develop infections from the constant filth. Coal dust coats their lungs, their eyes, their dreams. You lean against a rail and feel the thrum of the engine. It's like a tired heartbeat, steady but strained. Meanwhile, equipment fails. Some of the ships have hull damage from storms. Others have bent gun barrels or misaligned turrets that haven't been properly fixed. The maintenance crews do their best with what they have, rope, grease wire, but the results are often makeshift. On one ship, the electrical system shorts out entirely for several hours, leaving the crew navigating by lantern light and stars. You watch as a sailor rewires part of the navigation panel with copper wire stripped from a communications relay. It works, barely. Then there's the logistics nightmare. Coal isn't just heavy, it's a constant burden. The fleet needs to refuel every few 100 miles. That means pausing often in foreign ports to take on supplies. But refueling at sea, that's an art form. One misaligned rope and tons of coal tumble into the ocean. The Japanese, on the other hand, have efficient, well-coordinated resupply chains, often aided by a supportive population and domestic infrastructure. The Russians, they rely on foreign agents' secret rendezvous and the hope that their overloaded transports can keep up. You stand now near the radio room. Messages arrive slowly, if at all. Static crackles. Reports are outdated, full of half-truths or confusing codes. The officers have only a murky idea of where the Japanese fleet actually is. Some suspect they've already passed them. Others insist they're hiding along the strait. The uncertainty gnaws at morale. And then there's the ever-looming shadow of sabotage. Rumors swirl about spies, about Japanese agents hiding in coastal ports, about foreign-supplied maps leading them astray. One officer refuses to sleep without a revolver under his pillow. Another insists on posting a double guard around the ammunition hold. Some of this is paranoia, some of it is earned. Historians still argue whether Japanese intelligence played a decisive role in the psychological weakening of the fleet, or if the Russians were simply unraveling under their own weight. You look out from the bridge now across the vastness of Grey Sea. Somewhere beyond that haze is the Japanese fleet, quiet, focused, clean. You feel the contrast like a stone in your stomach. Your own vessel is tired. The crew is thinner than it was 2 weeks ago. The guns haven't been fired in anger yet, but already they rattle loose at the joints. This isn't an armada, it's a procession limping toward fate. And yet, no one deserts. No one mutinies, not fully. The fleet continues forward, bound by orders, honor, or simply inertia. You grip the rusted rail, feel the wind sting your face, and brace for the final stretch. Ahead lies Tsushima. Ahead lies Togo. You're staring now into a map, not printed on paper, but spread out across open sea. The Tsushima Strait, narrow and deceptively plain, stretches like a corridor between Korea and the Japanese island of Kyushu. To most eyes, it's just a body of water, a passage. But to Admiral Togo Heihachiro, it's a trap, waiting to be sprung, a natural funnel through which the Russian fleet must pass if it hopes to reach Vladivostok. And you, silent observer aboard the Mikasa, are watching every piece slide into place like a well-rehearsed stage play. Togo's strategy is simple in theory, devastating in execution. Wait for the Russians to enter the strait, then cross their line at the perfect moment, unleashing full broadsides while they're boxed in and confused. But this isn't just about brute force. Japan has prepared for this moment with a patience and precision that would make any chess grandmaster proud. You glide now above Japan's southern coast, where a network of wireless stations and lookouts dot the shoreline like scattered sentries. As early as May 26th, Japanese scouts have already begun tracking the Russian fleet's slow, lumbering approach. These aren't lucky sightings, they're the result of weeks of coordinated surveillance. Fishing boats, merchant ships, coastal patrols, all trained to recognize Russian silhouettes. One detail you overhear in a coastal outpost, a Russian battleship's mast, was identified not by its flag, but by the odd angle of a signal boom. That's how dialed in the Japanese are. Historians still debate just how much Togo knew. In real time, how detailed the intercepts were, whether he had decoded all Russian messages, but it's clear he had enough. He positions his fleet along the southern edge of Korea Strait, maintaining radio silence to avoid detection, all while keeping his ships fueled, supplied, and ready to pounce. The Japanese fleet isn't large, but it's lean. 4 modern battleships, 8 armored cruisers, dozens of destroyers and torpedo boats. And unlike their Russian counterparts, the ships are in top shape, cleaned, repaired, freshly fueled. You walk along the Mikasa's deck and note the difference. The brass gleams, the lines are tight, and every sailor knows his station. This isn't just military readiness, it's muscle memory. Back aboard the Russian fleet, confusion begins to creep in. The horizon is thick with fog. The radio buzzes with static. The Russian officers debate whether to steer through the Tsushima Strait or try a longer arc around the eastern coast of Japan. Rosistvensky, after much hesitation, chooses Tsushima. It's the shortest path, and time is slipping away. You feel the weight of that decision sink into the keel. Meanwhile, Japanese destroyers dart out in the night. They do not attack. They only observe, confirm, and then vanish. Imagine walking through a dark forest and knowing there are wolves just out of sight, padding silently behind you. That's what the Russians feel. They're being watched, and they know it. At 4:55 a.m. on May 27th, Japanese scout cruisers send word the Russian fleet has entered the strait. The sea is calm, the wind light, the weather, annoyingly for the Russians, favors visibility. The curtain rises. Togo holds his ships just out of sight beyond the Korean coast, giving the Russians time to commit to the strait. He wants them boxed in, unable to maneuver. By mid-morning, his ships are in motion, arcing northward like a hawk, preparing to dive. The Mikasa leads. Signal flags rise and fall with quiet grace. No shouting, just crisp execution. You feel it now, the tempo's shifting. The Japanese fleet is accelerating, turning with exacting precision. No collisions, no panic, just ordered motion. At 1:38 p.m., Togo hoists a signal that sends chills through the ranks. The Empire's fate depends on today's battle. It's not theatrical, it's true. Moments later, another signal. All ships advance to attack. The Mikasa swings into position. The Japanese fleet is now crossing the Russian line, cutting it like a blade across soft leather. You are standing at the heart of a military maneuver so perfect that it will be taught for the next 100 years. The Russians scramble, their formation buckles, some captains hesitate, others overshoot. The fleet, already exhausted, begins to unravel in real time. Guns are fired, but inaccurately. Some crews are disoriented by the sudden maneuvering. Others can't even see the Japanese ships through the smoke of their own funnels. And then at exactly 2:10 p.m. the Japanese unleash their opening salvo. The noise is indescribable. The Mikasa's 12-inch guns fire in succession, followed by cruisers and destroyers down the line. The sea erupts with geysers of water and steel. Russian decks shatter, masts snap. Men are flung into the air like toy soldiers in a child's tantrum. Shells hit with such force that they ignite powder stores and blow entire sections skyward. Odd detail, the Japanese used a special type of shell, filled with Shimo's powder, more powerful than traditional black powder and more prone to setting enemy ships ablaze. You can see its effects immediately. Within minutes, multiple Russian vessels are on fire smoke, pouring from shattered hulls. You look down from above as the lines of battle twist and writhe. The Russian formation is no longer a line, it's a scatter of wounded animals, some still trying to fight, others drifting helplessly. One Russian battleship fires at an enemy that's already turned away. Another circles in confusion. The Japanese, meanwhile, maintain discipline. Torpedo boats fan out to strike damaged ships. Cruisers focus fire, coordinating their shots like an orchestra of destruction. The trap is fully sprung. The Russians have nowhere to run, and Togo never once loses composure. You hover above the water as flames lick the sides of Russian hulls. Sailors abandon ship. Lifeboats are lowered amid chaos. A few officers continue barking orders, their voices lost beneath the scream of gunfire. The sea boils, and through it all, Togo stands at the bridge of the Mikasa, eyes fixed on the enemy, still and resolute. He has set the trap. And now, the sea is doing the rest. You brace yourself now in the heat of the fight, eyes stinging with smoke, boots slick with salt and ash. It's 2:20 p.m. and the Battle of Tsushima has exploded into full fury. Shells streak across the sky like divine thunderbolts. The sea, once a glassy mirror, churns with debris bodies and twisted steel. You don't hear the guns anymore, you feel them. Each blast rocks the air, shaking your lungs and stealing the breath from your chest. The Russian fleet, already disoriented, is unraveling quickly. Togo's crossing the T maneuver has worked to a devastating degree. You remember how proud it sounded in textbooks, how brilliant the geometry, but here in the bloody spray of real life, it's not geometry, it's slaughter. The Japanese broadsides tear into the bows of the Russian ships, who can only respond with their forwardmost guns, if those guns are even operational. Many aren't. A few are jammed, some crews forget their orders. At least one gunner fires blind, striking nothing but sea foam. You're aboard the Knyaz Suvorov, now the Russian flagship, and it is not doing well. It's already taken multiple hits to its superstructure. One shell decapitates the conning tower. Fires break out on the bridge. The rudder's jammed and the steering gears are dead. Rozhestvensky himself is badly wounded, his jaw shattered by shrapnel. Yet the crew continues trying to fight their guns, blasting into empty sea or at already burning silhouettes. One by one, Russian ships are isolated, surrounded or simply rendered immobile. The Japanese ships glide through the chaos with unsettling calm. Their gunners operate with the cold efficiency of men who've drilled for this 1,000 times. A Japanese destroyer darts in and releases a torpedo, silent, sleek, then boom. You watch the Russian battleship Oslabya list to port its bow, sinking fast. Within minutes, it's capsized. Some sailors swim for their lives. Others are pulled under in their full uniforms, boots too heavy to shed in time. A curious aside, several Russian ships still fly their battle flags long after they're technically out of action. Whether out of stubborn pride or simple chaos, the flags wave even as the ships burn or begin to sink. Historians still debate whether this was courage or confusion. Either way, the image is haunting flames licking around a bold imperial eagle, flapping defiantly in its final moments. You shift your gaze now to a smaller Russian cruiser attempting to flee the line. It veers sharply only to collide with another Russian ship. The two grind together in a wrenching metal embrace, guns uselessly pointed in opposite directions. A few sailors try to swing across with ropes. Most are thrown into the sea. And the torpedoes, oh the torpedoes. Japan unleashes waves of them as the battle intensifies. Destroyers zip in like angry hornets, loosing their payloads and vanishing back into the haze. The Russians have limited defense. Some of their ships weren't even properly fitted for anti-torpedo netting, and those that were often couldn't deploy it fast enough. You watch as one cruiser is hit midship and folds like a crushed can. The water swallows her quickly. Amid the mayhem, a Russian supply ship attempts to escape. It's barely armed, just a lumbering freighter packed with coal and dry biscuits. It turns south slow as a drifting cloud, hoping to slip past the blockade. It doesn't get far. A Japanese light cruiser intercepts, signals the order to surrender, then fires a warning shot across its bow. The Russian crew surrenders immediately. No fight, no protest, just raised hands and slumped shoulders. Meanwhile, on the Mikasa, Togo remains composed. He's issued minimal additional orders. His officers know what to do. That's the power of planning. That's the power of trust in command. He scans the horizon, tracking the shape of the Russian line or what's left of it. The Suvorov is now circling helplessly, her turrets frozen. Another Russian ship, the Alexander III, attempts a desperate charge, but is met with a torrent of shellfire so dense it looks like a curtain of smoke rising from the sea. You float down onto the deck of a Japanese destroyer now. The mood is focused, tense, but unpanicked. The crew knows the tide is turning. Still, they do not cheer. There are no cries of victory. They reload, they maneuver, they press forward. One sailor, during a brief pause, drinks water from a dented canteen, his hands shaking just slightly. His comrade says nothing, just places a hand on his shoulder, then returns to the torpedo rack. Odd moment of trivia. A handful of Japanese sailors reported later that they felt something like pity. Not for the enemy generals or imperial pride, but for the ordinary Russian sailors, many of whom had clearly been ill-prepared, ill-equipped and trapped in a machine much bigger than themselves. One officer wrote in his diary, "We burned them, yes, but we did not hate them." The sun begins to lower now, casting long shadows across the burning sea. The battle has only raged for a few hours, but the destruction is biblical. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the strait, many are already gone, sunk, disabled or captured, and the Japanese have not lost a single battleship. Smoke cloaks the water like a mourning shroud. You see lifeboats, now tiny specks in the swell, carrying wounded men toward Japanese ships or toward Korea's rocky coast. The sea is slick with oil ash and the hushed prayers of the nearly dead. Gunfire continues in the distance, but it's growing more sporadic now. The Russian line is no longer a line, it's wreckage. You sit down beside a Japanese officer on a scorched metal step. He's breathing heavily, arms across his knees. He's young, too young maybe. He stares straight ahead and mutters something under his breath, Yamato Damashi, spirit of Japan. He says it without irony, without drama, just as a reminder to himself. The battle is not quite over, but the result is no longer in question. You're drifting now among the wreckage, the echoes of cannon fire fading into the heavy, choking silence of aftermath. The Battle of Tsushima has mostly ended, but the dying has not. The sea is littered with twisted steel-charred planks, lifeboats packed tight, and bodies that float face down in their navy blues. Oil slicks glimmer on the surface like broken glass beneath the sunset, while the occasional moan or shouted command punctuates the eerie stillness. This is no longer a battlefield, it's a graveyard with waves. You hover beside the Suvorov, or what remains of her. She's still afloat, but barely a smouldering, crippled hulk, drifting aimlessly, her main guns silent, her command tower gone. Rozhestvensky has been evacuated from the ship unconscious, his jaw shattered and skull fractured. He'll be captured by the Japanese shortly and treated at a hospital with quiet respect. He won't return to Russia until after the war is over. Historians still debate whether he ever fully recovered from either the wounds or the humiliation. The surviving Russian sailors look around and see hell. Some leap into the water willingly, trying to escape flames licking at the deck. Others cry out for medics who are already dead. A few cling to lifebuoys and pieces of wreckage, dazed, half-conscious faces black with soot. You land beside one of them, a teenage sailor who's murmuring the Lord's Prayer between coughing fits. He can't find his brother. He doesn't know which ship he's on anymore, and when a Japanese rescue cutter approaches, he lifts his arms weakly in surrender. Yes, rescue. Because here's the quiet detail that surprises you. The Japanese Navy, though merciless in battle, does not ignore the survivors. Togo had issued standing orders that enemy sailors who surrender or are found adrift should be rescued, not executed or abandoned. Japanese destroyers and cruisers dispatch small boats to comb the water for survivors. They haul up enemy seamen, give them blankets, and in some cases offer water and first aid. It's not mercy from weakness, it's discipline. And it leaves an impression. By nightfall, the scale of the Russian disaster is undeniable. More than 20 of their ships are sunk or captured, thousands are dead. Over 6,000 Russian sailors are either killed or taken prisoner, while Japan loses fewer than 200 men. Some of the surviving Russian vessels manage to flee south, pursued by Japanese cruisers. Others limp toward neutral ports where they are disarmed and interned. Only a few make it to Vladivostok. You float now over the deck of the Admiral Nakhimov, where chaos reigns. Fires spread unchecked. Ammunition stores have been flooded to prevent explosion, but smoke pours from every hatch. A torpedo hit earlier in the day has bent her keel, and she's taking on water fast. Her captain gives the order to abandon ship. Sailors jump into the sea. A few attempt to scuttle the vessel so she won't be captured, but the water takes her faster than they can prepare. Elsewhere aboard the damaged Russian cruiser Aurora, a name that will become famous a dozen years later in the Russian Revolution, the mood is grim but less fatal. She's among the few ships to survive the day with minimal damage. The crew is exhausted, their ears ringing, but the vessel holds together. The Aurora will be interned by the British in Manila, and many of her crew will later return to Russia. Some will go on to become early supporters of the Bolsheviks. It's a strange, circular footnote, but such things happen in war. And as for the Japanese, you return now to the Mikasa. Togo stands on the bridge, arms still folded behind him. He hasn't spoken much since the final salvos. His officers await his assessment. He says only, "This is a victory, granted by heaven and by the Emperor." Then he gives a final order. All ships are to prepare for the rescue of survivors and repairs where needed. There's no cheering, no celebration, just the quiet knowledge that they have done what few thought possible. Japan has destroyed the naval pride of a European empire decisively, elegantly, and with terrifying speed. You walk through the Mikasa's corridors now, where sailors mop blood from the deck, and engineers tend to overheated engines. One man sings softly under his breath, a lullaby maybe, or a prayer. It's hard to tell. Later, Russian prisoners are brought aboard. They are treated with a kind of restrained respect. Medical officers tend to wounds. Some Japanese sailors offer cigarettes. There are no jeers, no beatings, just long, hollow stares across a cultural divide. One Russian officer bandaged and stunned salutes Togo without being prompted. Togo quietly returns the gesture. Odd historical note. The Japanese victory was so complete, so shocking, that many in the West refused to believe the early reports. British newspapers printed headlines with disbelief. French analysts called it impossible. In the US, naval experts began frantically revising strategic doctrine. After all, if Japan could do this to Russia, what might they do elsewhere? But for now, here on the quiet sea, you listen to the creaking of ships and the cries of gulls circling the wrecks. The smell of gunpowder lingers mixing with salt and the charred wood of lifeboats. A Japanese chaplain mutters sutras over a line of covered bodies on the deck. You close your eyes for a moment. The sea breathes. The waves lap softly at the twisted hull of a sunken cruiser. You drift among the broken masts, the floating letters, the helmets bobbing silently in the current. The battle is over, but its echo has only begun. You're standing now not on a deck or shore, but in the heart of the world's astonished gaze. The smoke over Tsushima has barely cleared, and already telegrams are racing across Europe and America. Morse code clacks in war offices, ambassadors whisper in drawing rooms, and generals, those proud epaulet-wearing, cigar-smoking men of empire, are forced to sit down and rethink everything they thought they knew. Japan has just sunk nearly an entire Russian fleet in a matter of hours, and no one in the West saw it coming. The reactions are swift, confused, and often tinged with disbelief. You stand beside a diplomat in London reading a dispatch. His monocle actually falls into his tea. He mutters something about upsetting the balance of power. Meanwhile, in Paris, editorialists pen column after column trying to reconcile the facts. Some dismiss the outcome as a fluke. Others point fingers at Russian incompetence. A few forward-looking thinkers, however, realize that the world has changed, and not quietly. This is the first time an Asian power has decisively defeated a European empire in modern warfare. It is not lost on colonized nations. In India, young nationalists read the news with wide eyes and tightened fists. In Egypt, whispered conversations begin about independence and dignity. In Vietnam and the Philippines, student radicals gather in cafes and discuss Meiji reforms. The Japanese victory sends a thunderclap through the colonial world. The West can be beaten. Historians still argue whether Japan's victory directly triggered decolonization movements or simply planted the seeds. What's clear is that it shattered the illusion of European invincibility. It proved that modernization, if executed well, could close the gap. And that changed everything. Back in Russia, though, the mood is far from analytical. It's rage, grief, humiliation. The Tsar's government, already strained from losing Port Arthur and the debacles in Manchuria, now faces its most crushing defeat yet. Over 6,000 sailors dead, dozens of ships gone, an entire fleet wiped from the map. The news breaks like a dam. Riots erupt in major cities. Students march. Factory workers strike. Soldiers refuse orders. You're walking now through the streets of St. Petersburg. The flags are at half-mast. The people are whispering the unthinkable, that maybe the Tsar isn't chosen by God after all, that maybe the empire is breaking. Russo-Japanese, who survived the battle but is now in Japanese custody, becomes a symbol of shame. Some blame him, others call him a scapegoat, but no one can deny that the loss has ruptured something deep in the Russian psyche. Odd footnote. When Russo-Japanese is eventually returned to Russia, he refuses to speak at the court-martial. He simply stands hollow-eyed and says, "I have nothing to say in my own defense." The court, stunned by his silence, lets him go. It's a gesture not of mercy but of collective embarrassment. Meanwhile, the Russian Navy's prestige is in tatters. What remains of it limps into port only to be greeted by ridicule and despair. The Black Sea Fleet, hearing the news, briefly mutinies in solidarity with the growing revolution. You hover now above the mutinous battleship Potemkin, a name that will soon be immortalized in film and myth, where sailors seize control, throw officers overboard, and raise a red flag. And all of this began not with a revolution, not with a manifesto, but with a naval disaster in the strait between Korea and Japan. The Battle of Tsushima, while fought with shells and steam, triggered political aftershocks felt across the globe. In Tokyo, on the other hand, the atmosphere is reserved but charged with pride. The emperor receives reports with a calm nod. Streets fill with lanterns, schoolchildren sing victory songs, and newspapers celebrate Admiral Togo as a living legend. Yet there's an undercurrent of something sharper, something more serious than celebration. The Japanese government knows what this moment means. It's not just about national pride, it's about negotiation power. You sit quietly in a diplomatic parlor in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Yes, America. Because as peace talks begin in the wake of Tsushima, it's US President Theodore Roosevelt who steps in to mediate the Treaty of Portsmouth. Both sides, Japan and Russia, agree to talk, but from very different positions. Russia is weakened, embarrassed, and desperate to stop the bleeding. Japan, though victorious, is financially strained and militarily stretched. The treaty ends the war, but not without bitterness. Japan gains recognition of its interests in Korea control over Port Arthur and half of Sakhalin Island. But it does not get war reparations. Many Japanese citizens expecting more protest the terms. Some even riot. It's a sobering reminder that victory doesn't always feel like triumph. Still, Japan walks away from the table not just with territory but with something far more valuable: international legitimacy. For the first time, it is treated as an equal at the table of empires. Togo becomes a household name across continents. Western military academies study his tactics. Newspapers print woodcut portraits of him with respectful awe. Even Roosevelt, whose moustache is famously unimpressed by most things, writes that Togo performed one of the greatest feats in naval history. You drift now back to Tsushima months later. The sea is calm again. The wrecks are mostly gone salvaged or sunk. The gulls circle lazily overhead, but the ghosts remain. This strait, once anonymous, has a name etched into textbooks and memory. Ships still pass through it today, tankers, freighters, ferries, but the water remembers. You return now to the quiet sea, the wake of battle long behind you, but its weight still anchored deep beneath the surface. The Tsushima Strait is calm again, glassy under morning light. The blood has washed away, the smoke has cleared, and the wind hums softly between the islands. But beneath those waves, history sleeps restlessly. You can almost feel the rusted bones of ships groaning from the ocean floor, still whispering the last orders, the unfinished prayers, the unspoken regrets of thousands who went down with steel and dignity. The Battle of Tsushima didn't just end a war, it rewrote assumptions, it redefined possibility, it fractured the confidence of empires and handed the pen of history, however briefly, to an Asian nation that had in living memory been ruled by shoguns and sword polishers. Japan had joined the table of world powers not by invitation, but by canon. But there's something slippery about triumph. You follow the Japanese victory parade through the streets of Tokyo now. The banners flutter, the children wave flags, the people chant Togo's name with reverence. And yet behind the excitement is a shift, subtle, unsettling. This isn't just about defense anymore. It's not just about proving themselves to the West. It's about destiny, expansion, prestige. A belief is blooming in certain quarters that Japan's rise is ordained, not merely permitted by modernization, but justified by superiority. Historians still argue whether Tsushima planted the first seeds of Japanese militarism, or if those roots had been growing all along. Certainly the victory emboldened Japan's ruling elite. By 1910, Korea would be fully annexed. In the 1930s, Japanese armies would march deeper into China, and by 1941, the very fleet that had stunned Russia would come for Pearl Harbor. The line from Tsushima to total war is not straight, but it's there. You hover now in a war college classroom in Annapolis, where cadets pore over diagrams of Togo's maneuvering. Chalk squeaks against blackboards, pointers tap across hand-drawn maps. The phrase "crossing the T" becomes sacred doctrine. British admirals rework their own naval formations. French commanders re-evaluate colonial defense strategy in Indochina. The Americans, sensing a new Pacific player, quietly increase their presence in the Philippines. But beyond war rooms and lecture halls, Tsushima leaves quieter echoes too. In political salons across Asia, reformers and revolutionaries alike reference it with awe. In India, a young Gandhi writes of the war with fascination. In China, the Qing dynasty crumbles partly under the weight of comparisons. Why can't we do what Japan did? In Africa, whispers grow louder. Perhaps the West isn't invincible after all. One battle changed more than borders. It shifted confidence. It made room for imagination. Odd legacy. In the decades following the war, Russian and Japanese veterans occasionally met not on battlefields but in memory. In the 1920s and 30s, reunions were held, stories exchanged. One Russian survivor told a Japanese sailor that he never hated his enemy, just the sea. Another once, a gunner aboard a burning cruiser, claimed the last thing he remembered was the sky turning orange, then black, then water, and then hands, Japanese hands, pulling him from the wreckage. You stand now aboard the Mikasa, preserved today as a museum ship in Yokosuka. Her decks are clean, her guns silent. Visitors walk her halls with respectful hush. Children peer through telescopes. Retired sailors snap photographs. The wood beneath your feet no longer shudders with recoil but creaks gently under sandals. A plaque commemorates the battle. A guide explains Togo's tactics, and though most of the listeners are tourists, there is still reverence in the air. Not for war, but for precision, for resolve, for the sheer audacity of what was achieved. And as you leave the Mikasa, you realize something. This was a turning point disguised as a sea battle, a moment when the world tilted slightly on its axis, when the maps didn't change overnight, but the way people read them did. Out at sea, the waves roll on, no flags remain, no torpedoes wait. But below those waters, somewhere near the bottom, lie rusted hulls and lost names. They do not cheer, they do not accuse, they simply rest beneath the roots of modern ships, beneath the chatter of sonar and the rumble of engines, reminding us that every victory echoes, and so does every cost. So now, as the waves grow softer and the battle fades into memory, let your breathing slow with the tide. The cannons are quiet now. The fires have long since gone out. Above the Tsushima Strait, the stars return to their ancient watch, indifferent and eternal. Ships no longer fire here. They pass silently, their engines purring like distant lullabies, unaware of the rusting giants beneath them. You can almost hear the hush of wind across the water, the creak of old timbers, the whisper of names long forgotten. Rozhdestvensky, Togo, Suvorov, Mikasa. They're not just in textbooks. They drift now in sea mist and dreams, part of a night's quiet unfolding. Let the wreckage fall away, let the maps close, let the medals and telegrams and telegram ink dissolve into the dark. All that matters now is that the waves kept rolling, that the world changed while the wind hummed softly over the water, that you were there just for a little while with the gulls circling above and the oil shimmering below, watching it all unfold from a safe, sleepy distance. Let your breath fall gently. Let your thoughts scatter like ash on salt water. History is heavy, yes, but tonight it can carry you. Far from battle, far from fire, just drifting, rocking softly now. The sea remembers, but you don't have to, not tonight.